Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your host, Mr. Sidney Brownwood.
Hello, good evening, and welcome to the January Lard Oddcast. With Christmas well and truly out the way, I thought it would be a great time to catch up with Rich and Nick to see what they're up to and what's on the agenda for 2018. So, gentlemen, welcome to the Oddcast. How was Christmas for you both?
Very festive.
That's good to know. And what was particularly good about it being festive? Was that just lots to eat, lots to drink, or were there any lard-related presents dished up under your Christmas trees?
No, actually, I got a pair of gloves and a piece of coal, which I think was. But I had bought myself some nice bits and pieces. I bought 200 quid's worth of Charlie Foxtrot buildings, and I had some fun in between Christmas and New Year putting them together, especially for my AWI collection. And I'll be able to tell you a bit more about that in the What's in the Workshop section.
We can see them from where we're sitting, and they look good, but let's not dwell on that at the moment. So let's move to Nick. Nick, Christmas for you at the Skinner household?
Christmas was fantastic, as always. Lots to be eaten and more to be drunk. And you remember that when we spoke before Christmas, I said that I wanted some time over Christmas to get some stuff done.
That was your number one present request.
Santa delivered on the time front. I was able to get some time to do a bit of painting and to get some ideas. I find Christmas is a really creative time for me because it actually gives you a chance to clear your head and get some ideas down on paper. So I've done quite a bit of writing over Christmas, which hopefully we can get some benefits from in the new year.
That sounds very good.
Very good. And I've got some Star Wars underpants, which might be a bit of over disclosure, but light and dark side, I can now do both.
Yeah, they look resplendent, but we would have preferred if you did wear trousers. Yeah.
Well, it's like the Death Star in 1-to-1 scale.
We just really don't want to go there. Okay, so after a few hectic episodes with trips away before Christmas, and of course with our fantastic live Christmas show in the bag, now's the time to get back to our original schedule for the show. And with that in mind, my next question is going to be, of course, what's in the workshop? So chaps, what's on your workbench at present, whether that's real or metaphorical? Richard?
Oh, a metaphorical bench. I got one of them for Christmas, funnily enough.
Very difficult to wrap.
It was, yeah. It didn't take up a lot of space under the tree, which was handy because everything under the tree was eaten by Freddie, the head of Lard Island Security and resident lunatic. Okay, well, I've been very, very busy at the tail end of last year in putting together some scenery for my AWI collection. AWI is one of those periods that I've always fancied doing and had always fancied doing and never really got round to until we did the second edition of Sharp Practice, at which point I kind of went mad and put together some fairly large armies for both sides because it's such a fun period. And in many ways I think it's one of the perfect periods for Sharp Practice because of the huge variety in troop types. It's not only have you got your normal troop classifications, but it's important with the force rosters to be able to differentiate between one lot of conscripts and volunteers and another lot of conscripts and volunteers, because some of them may be very aggressive, some of them may be hesitant, some of them maybe have a good drilled fire discipline, some of them may not. So that's one of the things that I really like seeing. So I put together some buildings from Charlie Foxtrot for that. And then on the main workbench is the metaphorical one, which is putting together a supplement for the AWI written by Chris Dawson, which follows the career or campaigns of the swamp fox down in the southern states of the United States of America. And it's really the final part in a trilogy, if you like, of three supplements that Chris has written for Sharp Practice. So this is the final piece of that jigsaw puzzle. So that's coming and that's really exciting. Nick and I have also been involved with a wizard, haven't we, Nicholas?
Well, this is true.
Not just any wizard.
No, not Bill from Rill.
Not Bill. No,
Not him.
Not Bill from Real, indeed. No. Not Harry from Barry.
Not him either.
But he is Welsh.
No. Well, he's Welsh.
He is
Yeah, he's Welsh.
Welsh.
Yeah,
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 you're
yeah.
lying, yeah.
And he fits in a matchbox, which is really handy.
That's right.
Who do we talk of?
Well, indeed. Mr. Michael Hobbs.
Oh, yeah, cool.
Star of Stage, Screen and Meeples and Miniatures podcast.
Yeah.
Hello, Meeps. And Mike, together with a couple of chums, Abe Deacon and James Ibbotson, who are halfway to Wales in their little cosy abodes in Evesham. I've been working on a set of fantasy rules, and so we haven't been involved in developing those, but we've been involved in doing a little bit of play testing with them, which has been great fun and really interesting. For somebody whose main background is very much historical, it's been a very interesting process because I've had a long affection for the works of Tolkien. And I was very keen that anything that we did in terms of fantasy was that kind of historical fantasy, if you like, where you can really base it on what happens in the real world, but also you've got other aspects in there, such as things like magic and creatures of fantastical proportions and capabilities. So we've been involved in doing some play testing with that, which has been fun.
It has. Some different troop types as well, something to expand the mind a little bit. You know, when you start to deal with monsters and creatures that don't have any historical statistics associated with them, it's kind of the world is your oyster, isn't it? Which is good fun.
Here?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Self-created monster with no historical statistics.
Well, I found myself, not for the first time in my life, developing a kind of strange attraction to monsters.
I was very worried there for just one brief moment.
They're kind of quite interesting, and when they're on the tabletop, they're also jolly good fun.
So what have you gone back to for your prime sources for this? Have you just gone back to Tolkien, and what are you using as a rule prototype, or what are the guys using as a rule prototype? Where have they started?
Well, to be honest with you, the amount of historical research we've done on it is zero, because we're letting them have their head and get on with it. I really feel it very important when you've got somebody developing a set of rules is you've got to allow them to take a project and run with it. I'm certainly not interested in interfering. The reason I like to get involved in the playtest process fairly early is just simply to see what's going on, and maybe to help out with any ideas that I might have, because having designed a few sets of rules over the years, you do find that you have a few systems potentially locked away in the memory banks that you've never used, that sometimes people can find good use for, which is something we've talked about before, I know. So we've really let them have their head and let them run with that, but it's just been quite fun to do something different.
Yeah, and the guys are basing it on a system that you recognise as being sharp practice-esque, but there's some other nuances and mechanisms in there that the guys have brought in for their own play testing, which is going to give it a flavour for the period that is going to really make it stand out, hopefully.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah, I have been involved in creating the background world for that,
which
is something I've really enjoyed.
That was fun, wasn't it? We had a good session on your whiteboard creating
we did,
creating the geography of the lands that time forgot, or whatever it may be called.
Yeah, it's not called what's written on that board, I can assure you.
Well, that probably wouldn't get past the censor anyway,
No,
so that's probably a good thing.
But
What else rhymes with Bilbo?
yeah, so no, that has been fun. What we tried to do is to create a world that is plausible, but at the same time fantastical. And that's been great fun. I did actually many years ago create a whole fantasy continent, and we never got to play. Never actually played any games with it, but it was quite an interesting process. This is kind of obviously been somewhere, in my psyche, that I've always fancied doing it, and it's been great fun. Designing something that's got lots of character, but also I think has a plausible reality to it, albeit an alternative reality. But yeah, that should create some fantastic game opportunities and campaigns, which should be great. Yeah, so we're kind of leaving the lads to it now. Let them proceed at their own speed, because I've said before that designing a set of rules is not a mechanical process. It's more of a sort of artistic process, and you have to take as much time as you need to do that. So we're letting them run with that, and hopefully they'll invite us across for a game every now and again, and we'll go and do that, because it's good fun to do that, have a few beers and chew the fat about where they've got to. So that's kind of a big thing on the workbench. I've also got the fact that I'm working on an early war handbook for Chain of Command, which is the first of the theatre-specific handbooks that we've got that we've got rolling out over the course of this year and next year. So that's keeping me very busy in terms of research, which is great fun. And I think I'm going to use that as an excuse to jump across in the tunnel and nip over to France before very long, and maybe walk the retreat back to Dunkirk or some of the French actions after that, which could be fun. Yeah, it could be great fun. So yeah, all busy really. And Nick, you're dabbling with a few bits and pieces.
Yeah, I'm trying to ride the wave of the creative process from Christmas. So I find it quite an easy time to come up, with some new ideas to play with. So we're going to be doing some play testing with some new ideas, new mechanisms, and see where that takes us in terms of rule development. Yeah. Some things been doing around, I've been doing some things around thinking around Kiss Me Hardy, which is still a long way from coming out in the second edition, I should say, at this point.
Yeah.
But there's some ideas about how we would reshape that I've got forming in my head. So on the workbench is around producing more output, actually, in terms of written output. So I'm quite happy with the way my painting's going. I'm doing some more French-Indian Wars. Nice. I've still got the odd Napoleon. I paint in very small batches because I have a very small retention span and my time windows are quite small. So I tend to paint in batches of 10, 12 figures. So I just do some Chain of Command, I do some World War II stuff, I do some bits for sharp practice. So really just trying to get those creative, some things down on paper to put some ideas together that we can then bash around and think, what do we do with these? Do we throw them in the bin, or can we use them and make some sense out of them for our next project? We've got a couple of ideas of where our next project will be. I'm kind of feeling quite excited at the moment. Yeah. Maybe that's the the alcohol-induced lens of Christmas, but it's
all those
hopeful. Yeah, that's right. I'm hopeful.
Good. Well, isn't it interesting actually how having a little bit of time off can leave you feeling your batteries have recharged? Because we're sitting here and we normally say, oh yeah, I built a house out of MDF and I bought a plastic bridge, and then all of a sudden here we are after having a few days off, Christmas bubbling over with ideas.
Yeah. Well, what I'm hoping also is that you can get in your AWIS gear that you've been making, is that you can put together some kind of redoubt that we can use for French Indian Wars.
Oh well, yeah, that could be great fun. One thing I must mention, which actually is physically on my physical workbench, is this. Oh, that didn't make a very good noise. I mean, is this?
Add a sound effect. Yeah. Oh, that made it even worse.
Oh dear. Well,
it just splintered into 1,000 pieces.
What, you may ask, is that you have in your hand?
What is that in your hand, Richard?
Well, it is, Sidney, the War Games Illustrated trophy for the best game of 2017.
It's an impressive looking trophy.
It is, well it was.
It was.
It was also an impressive looking coffee table. However, that's a trophy we won for Chain of Command, which was a set of rules that's been out there 3 years since it was published, to get the an award from one of the premier magazines in wargaming is something I'm really, really pleased with. So I have actually put it on my workbench to remind me every day to aspire to greater things.
It's a great piece of recognition.
It is. And what's nice is I can put it on several workbenches now, as it's in several bits.
It's quite weighty, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. But yeah, no, that's good. Anyway, I just thought, bit of bragging rights, might as well come out with it.
I think that's well deserved.
Thank you. But enough of my twaddle, Sidney. What have you been up to?
A little bit of painting and also some thinking as well. So you might remember about a year ago.
Thinking?
Occasionally I do.
So this time last year you had a thought.
I only get one a year, so I like to sort of bring them to everyone's attention. So you might remember the 30 Years War game that we played, which was Lutzen, which we played in around about November, about a year ago. And now I'm interested in sort of doing Nordlinger and really working on those rules. And it is interesting about this time of year that you do get the time to sit down and think, well, how would I really sort of develop the set of rules that we'd be working on? So I've had a couple of playtest games with a friend of mine from Canada, Kurt Campbell, who was over in November, and another playtest game over the Christmas holidays. And we're really working on the rules, trying to think about ways to improve some aspects of the rules and bring other aspects to the fore. And also doing a bit more painting with those very, very tiny sort of 2mm figure blocks that you get from irregular miniatures.
Yeah.
Which really don't look like much when they're in isolation, but over a table, a small table, you can really reduce one of the iconic battles of history to a playable game in the course of a club evening. That's really the ambition there. So trying to sort of create the right look, trying to create the right rules to deliver that has been quite an interesting process. So doing a bit of painting on those figures and thinking about the rules, rewriting bits of the rules. So hopefully we'll be able to get a game out on our club sometime January, February this year.
Okay, good. So you played it with your friend from Canada?
Yeah, who I wrote the rules with.
Right.
The rules were sort of a joint process.
Okay. And then you had played it, tested it again over Christmas?
Over Christmas and New Year, that's right.
Was it a special invite, but only, was it?
You're invited.
These are specific friends, are they? As opposed to people you just know casually?
I can tell there's a sore point which is being poked here. I apologise to both of you, but I want it to be really...
Not offended.
No.
But I thought I'd try and get it working in all respects before I unveil it before you both.
Anyway, Nick,
Yeah.
anything you want to add to that?
Well, I was thinking emphasis on the two fat
Oh,
lardies.
yeah, absolutely, yeah. And the off. Oh, there isn't an off, right, okay. Right, okay, good.
So there we are. Let's get rid of our boiler suits now and leave the dusty old workshop behind as we move on, quite literally, to today's big issue. I was thinking over Christmas about what I felt made the rules that you guys produce stand apart from the crowd. And in the end I was torn between whether it was emphasis on the rules being fun or the rules being historically accurate. So as a starter, which would you say it is?
I think it's both.
You can have both, can't you?
Yeah, I always get very frustrated when online people go, do you want rules which are historical or do you want rules which are fun? And you think, I'm not sure whether that's just a false dichotomy or just a load of bollocks, because ultimately there's no reason why you can't combine history with fun. So, and I think what we try and do is we definitely put the emphasis on providing an historically plausible experience, but at the same time we want the game to be fun, because fun's the type of guys we are, mate.
Well, that's really what I was getting at. A historically plausible experience ties in with my thinking. And with that in mind, my big issue today is when you research a period, how do you establish the way in which men fought and the way in which their leaders command them? In other words, how do you as game designers understand what actually happened on the battlefield in war? How do you go about that process of understanding? Not necessarily what you're finding, but how do you find out about it?
Okay.
Finding as many sources as you can and reading them.
I think that's it, really. I think one of the things that's absolutely key is if you are going to design a car, you need to understand how the internal combustion engine works. If you're going to design an aircraft, you need to understand the principles of flight and how things work. And not only do you need to have a general understanding of it, you really have got to have a pretty comprehensive understanding and hopefully some kind of way of proving that before you say to somebody, here's an aircraft, why don't you go and try flying in it?
Yeah.
And I think that there's a real parallel there with designing war games rules, is that the game designer really does have to try and understand the period as much as they possibly can. I'm not suggesting that all wargamers need to have a degree in history. I don't have a degree in history, in fact I don't have a degree in anything. But I think the emphasis is on the games designer to get the history right, so that people can just enjoy the game, and hopefully when they walk away from the game they'll go, I really had fun playing that game, but hopefully they'll also go, wow, I really feel like, you know, I understand a little bit more about that conflict now, because through having actually played the game. For me, the starting point is always having a look at drill books of a period, because I tend to think that that's if you like, the theory. I have to say that my interest in military history really starts with the advent of the muzzle loading rifle, and then particularly with the breech loader, because it's at that point, I think, where we move away from tactics where troops can just line up in dense formations and present their muskets and fire at each other, to a point where troops are actually having to think about the way that they operate on the battlefield, because if they're there together in dense formations, then they become a pretty painful target for people shooting at them. So I have always found that the periods that I'm interested in, I tend to be able to access those drill manuals. I mean, you can, to a degree, access drill manuals going all the way back to the ancient period. However, how reliable some of them are questionable. I mean, again, if you look at the English Civil War, I'm reaching across here to one of the books that I've got with me here, which is Military Discipline or the Young Artilleryman by Colonel William Barris. Is a phenomenal manual of arms. However, the fact of the matter is, I doubt that anybody involved in the English Civil War was actually using everything in there, because it's so hyper theoretical that the man in the street, and more to the point, the man who's not a professional soldier, is just a civilian who's gone to war, is simply not going to be able to work his way through those machinations. So the drill book's important, but it is only a starting point. Once you've got that, it's important to then read first-hand accounts, which give you an indication of how troops actually fought in reality. And the things that you will find in that is that some troops were using the drill manual and were using it very, very effectively, whereas other troops were, a little bit more hesitant, reticent, less well trained. So it's important to get that idea by reading those first-hand accounts. Now, the problem that we've got is that nobody writes a first-hand account of their experiences in the Second World War, focusing on how they did or did not use the 1938 section leaders handbook, or the 1944 version of the platoon leaders handbook. What they write about is their own personal experiences. So you tend to find that you end up doing something which my old friend Paddy Griffiths used to allude to, which was called tactical snippeting. So you will find yourself reading all sorts of books, first-hand accounts, in the hope of finding out little bits of information, which are little scraps, which you then can hopefully stitch together into a more complete tapestry. And then by taking all of those accounts, you can then hopefully try and make some informed decisions about what actually happened in reality.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. The tactical snippeting is really important, because it's through that depth of reading that allows you to look at how tactics evolve during that action as well. So we said, haven't we, in the past, about how armies tend to go into wars, armed with the doctrine that they learned from the last war, and they very quickly have to change their practices to suit the current environment. And the more you can read around how that developed through personal narrative, you can see how these decisions were made on the battlefield. So my own thinking on that is that when I read an account of a battle, I look at that battle through my own lens, through the lens of a fat Englishman in the 21st century. And I can read one account and it will give me a view through a lens, the lens of that writer on that action. And then I have to read another one to give another lens on it, to see a different account from a different perspective. And then another one to see another account from another perspective. So which is why if you go to many historians and wargamers' houses, they haven't got one book on the Battle of Waterloo. They've probably got a whole bookcase on the Battle of Waterloo. Now the chronological story of Waterloo is probably not argued that much, although I guess there are bits of it that are. But actually, why has that person got that many books on it, apart from the fact that they like to collect it and it looks good on the bookcase? It's because each one of those books has potentially something in it that helps you put the pattern together of what went on. So the more you can read, the more you can understand. And it is about, therefore, how can I tie these dots together to get a view of what went on? And I can read through individual accounts from individual men who are really there, their experience, and then tie that back to the doctrine. What I can see going on here. What sense can I make of the story that this man is telling me?
I think that's a real process, isn't it, of getting beyond a historical veneer. You know, the perception that you've checked whatever the starting point is, and you're deepening your experience. You're really looking at some of the context in which the battle was fought and from different persons' perspectives.
Yeah.
And I think you need to consult different sources to be able to do that. So if you're looking at the 19th century or the 20th century, the official history or a regimental history would give you one thing. A personal narrative in a diary or a letter would give you something else. And a memoir written 20 or 30 years later would give you something else again.
Yeah.
And I think that you could have a perfectly credible war game which is based around the official history of events, or the Mark Adkins book on Waterloo, which is a fantastic resource.
Yeah.
You know, that is a great starting point, and you can create a very detailed model of Waterloo. But once you read on, you'll realise that all those historians, if they've done their job properly, will have themselves gone through a similar process of synthesis. And they, like Peter Hocherer, for example, with Waterloo, will have decided that certain aspects of Waterloo validate his own approach to the battle, which is one of accentuating the Prussian role.
Confirmation bias. Yeah.
Allegedly
Yeah.
biased, that's right.
Yeah.
And I think that process of looking in depth at the context of a battle or a conflict by in itself gives you a greater understanding. Whether that has an immediate effect relating to the rules that you're writing is another question, but I think creating those sources gives you a depth which you just don't get by just looking at one or two.
No, you're right. But if you go into an account looking for something, you will find it in there. You'll make it up you make the connection up in your own head, and you'll make that connection. Which is why views from the other side of the fence are so really, really important.
That's something I've just written down actually as we're talking here. Just under the heading of minefields. I've written 3 of them. National myths. If you start off from a viewpoint where you believe the national myth, you are absolutely on a hiding to nothing. You've really got to try and empty your head of all preconceived ideas and literally just start reading and start establishing what are the points where you can drive a spike into the ground and say, actually, I believe this happened at this point here. Right, you can nail that down and say, okay, that's a point that I think is right. And then you start putting lots of other spikes down in the ground, and ultimately you'll get a matrix of which hopefully are lots of points that you can believe, and then the gaps in between intelligence allows you to kind of fill in some of those bits. But national myths, horrific. That the worst thing you can do is start playing the AWI and believe some of the stories about lobsters and patriots. And it's very, very difficult to challenge people about national myths. You know, if you go into a pub in Australia and tell them that there were more British troops at Gallipoli than Australians, you are likely to get punched in the face. I mean, I have to say, I find that when I talk to Australian wargamers about this, they're fully aware that these things are not the case, and they've obviously probably read more than the average man on the Clapham omnibus. But there's lots of people who believe those national myths because that's the way we've all been kind of programmed to think. But the next thing is that you've got to avoid is reading the first book and then looking for information to back up that viewpoint. You've got to accept the fact that the first book you read you might enjoy reading it, but it might actually be a complete load of old rubbish. And the other thing is seeking confirmation. That was the third point. If you go into it looking to find data to back up your preconceptions, you're absolutely on a hiding to nothing. As I say, you've almost got to try and brain dump everything that you thought you knew about it and start again from a completely with a completely blank sheet of paper. And certainly, if you can, get information across both sides of the fence, as we were talking about. Finding out, for reading your accounts about the Battle of Britain and purely reading the accounts of RAF pilots is going to give you one perspective, but then read about what the Luftwaffe thought of them. Read about what the Polish pilots who were involved thought about them. Read about what the Italian pilots who were involved.
Well, that's a tough thing to do, though, isn't it? You know, so there's some research, wasn't there, about in the Second World War about how pilots survived dogfights. And actually, of course, the only pilots you can interview about how you survive a dogfight is a pilot who survives a dogfight. The pilot who doesn't survive can't be interviewed. No. So the data is quite difficult to come across in some of these cases. So the accounts that give the story from the other side of the wire are that much more powerful as a consequence of it. So look at first-hand accounts of German troops in Normandy, for instance. You know, they're quite hard to come by, but they're really insightful when you find them.
Very insightful. Interestingly, actually, talking of researching aerial warfare, as we touched on the Battle of Britain, I have found that getting first-hand accounts of the Great War in the air is almost easier than getting accounts of the Second World War in the air, because those guys were at the very advent of aerial warfare, and so a lot of them wrote about it. And whereas in the Second World War, I think there was a sense that it was a little bit more normal, and the interest doesn't seem to be quite the same. But yeah, you've got to go out there as somebody researching a period before you write a set of rules and try and develop your own decisions. And I find what is always interesting about this is, as you read on a subject, you actually find that so much of what you did think is complete twaddle, absolute rubbish.
And I think that is that's exactly what I have frequently found, and I think that is very difficult sometimes to do with, because one inevitably creates a conception of what one's looking at as one goes through those sources, even if you're aware of trying to avoid going with a preset idea of what you're trying to find. As you find an increasing number of sources about a period, about a battle, it becomes often very, very difficult to reconcile all of those together, because in each of those sources you're looking at the bias or the argument of somebody who's written that. Perhaps less so of a contemporary who's there, although that's not always the case, because if the contemporary is on the losing side, their memoirs are almost always going to sort of exonerate them in one way or another.
Everybody's first-hand account is to a degree self-serving.
So trying to sort of synthesise all that together, I think you sometimes come to a process in any sort of historical project that you think, well, I haven't really got anything at all. All I've got is a jumble, a mass, a jigsaw, to use your analogy, Rich. You know, you've got all the threads in a big pile on the floor and you haven't got any tapestry at all. But at least I think you've made progress there. You've encapsulated the entirety of what you want to try and find out in your own language. Additional language skills are obviously invaluable, great, but that's not always possible. And then you've got your working base to which you can attempt to sort of synthesise and create a model, if you like.
Yeah, and a model is a simplification of reality,
Yes.
which is always the definition I use in my head. And the other side about that is that when you're reading these personal narratives, they are not technical, they are emotional, and they are morally based. And so therefore that's a window on the wall that is really hard to model. Okay, but it's really something that we try to look at when we do our games. So our games, the characteristic of our games, I think, or I like to think, is that they're technically strong, but they're not technically focused. The focus is on the human, because that's what you read about. That's the story that's coming down to you through the ages, is of the personal experience of what this was like, and how these guys are basing their decisions, and what's influencing the way that they act, which is doctrine and experience, and how they work around that loop to learn about what they're going to do next. And the more you read around war, the more you are able to shine some of that light from one period into another, because you can start then to recognise patterns of the way things develop, and you can then start to extrapolate fairly reasonably what might be going on. Always being aware that you're shining your own lens on it.
Yeah, it's impossible to read accounts of the way German troops operate in the Second World War without recognising that what they're doing is they're applying the tactics that they learned in the Great War. Now, if you've never read about the Great War, you can't recognise that. But so it's important to understand that there is continuity. No war exists in a vacuum. The reason troops behaved in 1914 as they did, the British troops behaved in 1914 as they did, was based on their experiences in the Boer War. So to fully understand the Great War, you've got to read about the Boer War, and to fully understand about the Second World War, you've got to understand the First World War. And then all of a sudden you realise, actually, if I'm going to understand the experience of the British in the Boer War, I also need to be looking at what conclusions they came to from reading about the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. And if I'm going to read about the Franco-Prussian War, I actually have to take into account the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. And then I have to take into account the Danish War of 1864, because all these experiences are interlinked. And then all of a sudden you realise that nothing exists on its own. This is all part of a natural progression, and by attempting to understand as much of that as possible, it does allow you to come to certain conclusions. And if you, for example, look at the evolution of infantry tactics from 1914 up to date, you can see that that is one single continuous process, and at no point in time has that stopped happening. So you look at the fire and movement tactics of the First World War, which were polished up to the fire and movement tactics of the Second World War, which were then polished up to be a slightly different set of tactics in Afghanistan, say. But you can see that there is continuity throughout that, and there's a lineage that goes right the way through, from the lessons learnt on the Somme to what's happening in Helmand, or has been happening in Helmand recently.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting steps in that sort of understanding that process is being able to sort of keep in mind through perhaps 2 or 3 different things. So on the one thing there is the theory, which is developed through the manuals or the drill books, as you were mentioning.
Yeah.
The other thing is the actual events which are taking place, because there is a physical event which is taking place, there is a conflict, there is a result of a conflict, one side is beaten and one side is successful.
Yeah.
And the third thing is the reasoning behind why one side won. And that really comes out in the context, I think, of some of the writing from the Great War, thinking of the German side in particular, Ernst Junger. So one of the books that people would always say, well, Storm of Steel is a great book all about German stormtrooper tactics. When I looked at Junger, he wrote the book very quickly after the war, and then rewrote that book 5 or 6 times through different publishers, and the book changes significantly. And putting that book in the context of his other non-military work, and also COTS 125 and some of his more philosophical works, you get to the point of thinking that really Storm of Steel really isn't a book about stormtrooper tactics at all. It's really his personal experiences of war, illuminated through that prism of his personal experience. And I think that's what's quite difficult with when you start out with theory and you get to an actual physical military result, that some of the steps that you take to try and make you understand why that result happened don't always happen in sequence and that's why I think you're right to call it a process. And understanding that process and understanding really why that result is taking place, that can be very complicated, and inevitably, when you look at the data that you've assembled or the sources you've assembled, you're really forced as a rules writer or a designer of a war game or a scenario to make certain evaluations along that journey.
Yeah, and wars are won by learning organisations. The belligerents that go into that conflict and who learn the fastest are going to come out with the best results. So it's a kind of Darwinist approach, I think, that creates victory. It's not the strongest of the species nor the most intelligent, but the one that's most adaptable to change that will win through in the end, to misquote Darwin. So what you see in war is that process. An army will go into a war with a doctrine. It will very quickly learn that actually they need to change things. So they go around this whole sort of learning cycle of, I have a concrete experience, I learn from that, I reflect on it, I abstract some ideas, and I try something else out. And the army that can go round that loop the fastest will often be the one that comes out with the most successful. They'll develop the new model army, for instance, or they'll think about changing their fighter pilot tactics from flying in a Vic of 3 to realising that a Finger 4 is much more flexible. It's the speed and ability that they can get around that loop that enables them to win out in the end.
Yeah, and I think some of the most fascinating books in this particular area are where the author, the historian, takes you from the point of theory to the result of that theory being applied in practice. There's a great book by Robert Foley called German Strategy and the Path to Verdun, and it really relates to the German theory of this sort of huge battle, this huge engagement in which you'd have this titanic struggle between these two national identities, and there would be a result, and that's the type of theory that precipitates Falkenhayn's decision to sort of focus the battle on Verdun. It doesn't work like that, and the breakdown of the theory into practice within that book is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, and you take that through to decision making on the battlefield. It's the, again, we come back to the speed with which people can go through those processes, go through those loops to beat their opponent. I'm going to talk about the OODA loop in a minute if we're not careful. But it's around that process of being able to do things more quickly in a more refined way, using the resources you've got to get a better outcome more rapidly. And it's kind of a theme
Yeah.
that runs through all of history, I think.
Can I just go back to the tactical snippeting thing? Well, you were saying about Younger and Storm of Steel. Storm of Steel? Did I really say
That's
that?
the Scottish version.
The Sean Connery read
Yeah,
audio
that's
book.
right. I think what you have to look at there is if you read Storm of Steel alongside a book on the development of German stormtrooper tactics, what you see in Younger's work is an affirmation that those tactics were actually used. He doesn't say, yes, we used drill manual number 453 and we attacked like this, but he does talk about the use of grenades to precede an attack and the immediate follow-up on that, and he does talk about the use of trench brooms and the clearing of trenches and the way things were done. So what you take from that is tiny little snippets that you think, yes, they were doing it. We know we were doing it. I mean, I've got a book in my hand which I've just picked off the shelves here, which is called Welsh Guards at War. Now, you can read through the whole thing, and it doesn't at any point in time talk about tactics on the ground, apart from one quote where they are attacking across a hill in Italy, and the commanding officer is saying that he stood and he watched one of the most impressive examples of section firearm movement being put into place that he's ever seen in the war. Now, what does that tell you? It doesn't tell you very much, but it does tell you that he knows what section firearm movement means. I mean, I know a guy, a wargamer, who is very, very insistent that the British Army platoon training manual, where the Bren team puts down fire and the rifle team then manoeuvres off that, did not happen in reality, and his reasoning behind that is that his dad said it didn't happen. Well, that's fair comment. I mean, I've got a report here written by a lieutenant colonel who was making observations in Sicily in 1943, and he was asked to. His name was Wigram. He was asked to make his observations on infantry tactics. And he was saying that the way infantry tactics are taught within regular battalions, yes, they are working very well, and he can see regular troops being able to apply them, and that's probably why the Welsh Guards were doing it. But he was saying in some more hastily raised formations, they weren't being used at all, and he was recommending there actually splitting the platoon down into one big Bren team of 3 Brens, and one big manoeuvre team of all the rifle teams put together of about 12 to 15, 16 guys, and just having a big clunking fist, lots of firepower and lots of manoeuvre. Well, that's what we were saying earlier about variation on a theme, and when we put chain of command together, yes, we are saying this is how your platoon is organised, but you have got every right within that to say, actually, I don't want to organise it like that. I'm going to reorganise and put my Brens together and do what Wigram says. And so it's only by reading reports like Wigram's report, and it's only by reading accounts and getting tiny bits of information in that whole book covering the Welsh Guards at War, you've only got a couple of sentences, but they do affirm that section level firearm movement was used.
And I think that's a fantastic way of leading on to sort of another point on Younger's book, because I absolutely agree with that, because your tactical snippeting approach to a book like Storm of Steel is utterly justifiable, because that is what you get from Cops 125, that is what you get from Storm of Steel, because he does write about his personal experiences. In his first edition of the book, it's really written for the veterans he served with, and it is then rewritten in about 1923 and then 24 with new publishing houses and new editors, to really sort of fit his personal philosophy, which is the human experience in war and the triumph of the human spirit. That's very little to do with trench brooms, that's very much little to do with the organisation of his squad. But the tactical snippeting that you get from a book like Storm of Steel is absolutely invaluable, and it bears out everything that, or certain of the preconceptions that one might have of the use of German stormtroopers and their effectiveness, certainly against the British in 1918, if not the French in 1918. Yeah. So using sources that are readily available in a way which is slightly different, not taking the whole of the prejudice of the author or the whole of the literary approach that the author might have, I think is a really interesting way of using sources in a different way. So that's absolutely the way that I've always sort of taken Ernst Junger is really as a writer first, but then a writer who has certain aspects. And also on Junger as well, it's very interesting the translation of Junger. When the original translation is done, it's done by a British guy into English in the 1920s who writes about just things like wire. And it is clear that he writes about wire as we would understand it, as barbed wire. Michael Hoffman in the 2003 translation doesn't translate the wire as wire, he translates it as something else. That's a really interesting point that when we look at sources and we look at the translation of the sources, how close is the translator to the events which will happen, and what does the translator bring on board as well?
Yeah, no, that's very true. That's a very good point.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those stories about the further you are away from it, the less clear your view can be. Yeah. We don't have first-hand experience of being in the Battle of Agincourt, and nobody alive does. And yet somehow we can paint a picture of what that might have been like.
And I think the further you go back in history, the more difficult sometimes it is to create your tactical snippets of things which are sort of at least ostensibly directly relevant to a battlefield. Yeah. But what you do get is a very rich context of a historical, political, diplomatic, economic event. And those are things that, I certainly think when you created Dux Britanniarum, you brought into the campaign game. There weren't necessarily enough things which were available about how a Romano-British formation would line up. So we look at other things such as archaeology, we look at
hagiography, looking at the lives of the saints. I think we've touched on this before, but the further you go back, the less sources there are, and the more utterly unreliable they are. However, in those situations, you have to try and extrapolate what you can from other sources. So you can look at archaeology and you can look at the way a weapon is structured and understand from that, is it designed for stabbing or is it an edged weapon? And you can gain a comprehension of the way they fought by looking at that type of evidence and taking that alongside things like illustrations from columns and well, not so much first-hand accounts, but accounts written close to the time. But it as you go back into myths of time, it certainly becomes a lot harder, and you have to start taking a leap of faith in some areas. But that's really why I like to focus on stuff that's in a relatively modern world. So let's say from the Age of Reason onwards.
So one thing just to leave this discussion with, one final question, is that we've done our tactical snippeting, we've done our reading, we've assimilated our different sources. We're getting a sort of a picture of the battle which we're looking at, or the period. When do you stop? When do you stop and start writing the rules?
Well, it's a parallel process. I think once you're interested in something, you've got to get on the horse and ride it, and that involves starting to put figures on the table and doing your research in parallel with that. You've got to have a basic understanding of the period, but to be honest with you, as I say, because I tend to choose to select periods where I have got a reasonable understanding of those periods anyway, because I've been researching this stuff for 30 years. I'm not starting from a blank sheet of paper every time. Dux Britanniarum, I was starting from a blank sheet of paper, and that was an extraordinarily interesting research process. I mean, it was probably one of the most interesting periods that I've ever researched. But having said that, it didn't take long because there's almost bugger all written on it. You can read Gildas and Bede and Nennius, and then you're done, really. That's about it.
And then the straitjacket arrives.
And they're fantastically interesting, and I've said before, I'm very fortunate to live in St Albans, so we've got the Roman city of Verulamium there, we've got the museum there, and I spent time talking to the curator, who was able to give me quite a lot of information about how the city evolved around 400 AD, and with the withdrawal of the Romans and how they saw the granaries moved inside the walls, and it was definitely a period of conflict. But that's using social changes to try and guesstimate what was happening.
But you have to take a point at which you think you've got enough information to put something down on paper. There's always going to be a knowledge gap. There's always another account you can read. But if you don't take the time to put something out there, then would you get analysis paralysis? You'd never get anything published ever. So you have to put it out there and say, right, this is now at a point where I feel that I'm confident enough that we can put out a beta version and we can get something worked out on the table. And are we then are we starting to get the results and outcomes that we expect to see, or that fits the period as we understand it through the research and history that we know?
That's a really interesting point, actually, because that's just reminded me as we do go through that game play testing process, which is normally a year or so of time, you do find yourself not reading books to affirm what you're doing, but reading books and saying, right, I'm going to put this on the table and see how it plays out. And then saying, right, how does that stand up to what actually happens on the tabletop? And they make for some really interesting games. They make for great games. We've talked about it before. That's one of those situations where the guys who are playing the game have no idea it's a historical situation, and you can say to them at the end, well, this situation was actually a historical one, and this is what happened. And people are really interested in that. People really, really enjoy saying, well, what happened in reality, and having that story related to them. But it is very much part of that process where you're saying, how do the rules now stand up against what I read about in these accounts? And when you're finding you're playing games and you're getting the same results, you're thinking, okay, well, this is starting to work now.
Yeah.
Well, that was really interesting. As we stroll down the corridor now to the Lard Island Library, I'm hoping that you chaps have got some books that are going to illustrate what we've just been talking about. So, let me ask Richard and Nick, what are your book choices for this edition?
Okay, well, I was thinking about this, and really, pretty much I could pick any book off my shelves that is a first-hand account of action and say, this is a good example of the type of book that I have to read to do that tactical snippeting. And I've got any number of first-hand accounts on the shelves, because you need the books that are the big picture books to get an understanding of what the big picture situation is, but then it's going down to detail of the first-hand accounts that really gets you involved. But of course, no one book gives you much more than the tiny few snippets that you want. Then again, I could look at books like, I've got one here, The Prussian Campaign of 1866, a tactical retrospect by Captain Theodore May. A fabulous little pamphlet-sized book published by Helion and Company. If you're interested in military history, Helion and Company are a company you've really got to get familiar with. They produce some really excellent books for people who are interested in the nuts and bolts of military history. And a book like this is really good because this is a guy who took part in the War of 1866 and is then getting involved in the big hot debate of the time, which was really about, do you advance in open order and lose control of your troops, or do you advance in close order and get shot to bits? But retain control of your formations. And there was lots of arguments going on between 1866 and 1870, and then between 1870 and 1914. And the Germans had never really quite made up their mind exactly what their set tactics were going to be. So that type of book is really interesting. However, I am going to choose a more general book written by a guy, funnily enough, who was on the other side to Captain Theodore May, who wrote the Prussian Campaign Tactical Retrospect. This is a guy called Colonel Ardent Dupic, that's P-I-C-Q, and he is my peak of the week.
Was this whole section worked around that pun?
It was actually, yeah.
Oh, God.
No, it wasn't. Ardent Dupic, colonel of a French line regiment who died during the Franco-Prussian War.
At the peak of his powers.
At the peak of his powers, indeed. Ardent Dupic, very much the guy who invented, if you like, tactical snippeting, although it wasn't he who used that term. But, I'll just read you a quote here. Under the pressure of danger, impelled by the instinct for self-preservation, did he, the soldier, follow, make light of, or forget the methods prescribed or recommended? Did he fight in the manner imposed upon him, or in that indicated to him by his instinct or by his knowledge of warfare? And I think that for me sums up Ardon de Peek's approach to understanding military history, and he looks at history right the way through from the Romans up to the point where he died. And what he's really asking there is, okay, do the troops actually fight according to the theory, or do they go, no, I've got a better idea, or do they really just, in an almost animalistic form of self-preservation, do something else entirely? And he's quite right. Without gaining that understanding and appreciation of how troops actually act, we really can't say how wars take place. It's not important it is important what's in the drill manual, but the next stage then is to find out how relevant the drill manual was to what happened in reality. Battle Studies by Colonel Ardon de Peek is only about 200 pages long. It's a very easy read, and I would recommend it to anybody who wants to set about studying military history, because as a primer, it's easy to read, but it also gives some pause for thought on what we're looking to achieve. So I've had a hell of a job getting hold of this, and it looks like it was published by some Jippo by looking at the state of the book, but it wasn't. It's a pretty rough and ready thing, but you'll have to find it where you can.
Can I have a peek inside the book
You
by Peek?
can have a peek, indeed.
Piqued my interest now.
So moving on from that then,
Running out of puns.
as you've now run out of puns, what was your book?
He who'd pun would pick a pocket. What film is that from? Answers on a postcard. So yeah, well, I've gone down the route of a collection of personal narrative about action, and I've gone aerial. I've taken to the skies.
I thought you were going to do the washing.
Well, there are. So I said about warfare being emotional and morally based, and there's something about individual man-on-man action that goes with aerial dogfighting that kind of really emphasises the human aspects of the fight. So the personal narratives of dogfights tell a really interesting story of the development of war in the air. So for my book, I was faced with a couple of choices, but I wanted to go to the other side of the fence, and I wanted to look at some Luftwaffe stories from Luftwaffe pilots. Now there is a great series of books out there, which is the JG26 War Diaries, which are really, really highly recommended. They give a list day by day of the sorties that were flown by JG26 during the Second World War, which covers their actions during the Battle of Britain and on the Russian front as well, which makes really interesting for tactical snippeting about what was going on. Then the other side of that is what some of the pilot stories that go with that. So I picked as my book for this episode the Luftwaffe Fighters Battle of Britain by a guy called Chris Goss, who's also written the Luftwaffe Bombers Battle of Britain and Bloody Biscay and Brothers in Arms, which is around other individual aerial dogfight accounts. And what this gives is a narrative by narrative account of the Battle of Britain through the eyes of Luftwaffe pilots, and it gives therefore a real interesting story of the history of that action from the other side. And again, you can do tactical snippeting in this. So for instance, let me just read you this very, very brief piece which falls under my eye. So this is from Oberleutnant Hans Ulrich Kettling of Sturmgeschwader 76, so he's probably flying BF 110s, okay? He says this: our altitude was at about 15,000 feet and our formation disintegrated into swarm, attacking the Spitfires and keeping them away from the bombers, which had to continue on their course. All around, dogfights developed rapidly. and I followed my number one, Oberleutnant Lent, who went after 2 Spits to protect his rear. I heard Obergefreiter Volk working his machine gun, and looking back, I stared into the flaming machine guns of 4 Spitfires in splendid formation. So it gives you a lovely view of that fight through that guy's particular lens, and there's quite a lot of information in just those 6 lines actually about what that fight, how that fight started, how it started to disintegrate, what the formation the guys were using, the role that altitude played in the fighting, and how they broke down to fight in pairs. There's a lot of information in there, and this book is literally crammed with accounts similar to that. So you can really read each account as a different filter on your lens. You can start with an understanding of what you think the Battle of Britain is about, and by reading these, I don't know how many individual accounts there are in here, but by reading each one of these, you slowly start to build a wider and wider picture of what that action was like. So it's a riveting book, it's an excellent read, and I would recommend it to you.
That reminds me a bit of a book we've discussed before, which is At the Sharp End.
Yeah.
Which is where you have lots and lots of different accounts written by different people, which have been collated and edited to go together. That type of thing is always a good starting point, to be honest with you.
It just gives a flavour, and therefore if you're developing a war game and you want to try and put the wargamer in the place of that guy in his BF 110, that's the kind of experience you're wanting him to have. It's not really technically focused, it's a human focus.
Who publishes that, Nick?
So it's published by Cressy.
Right.
My version is a hardback. I think it's probably also available in softback. Available from all good booksellers, I would imagine.
Okay. Well, let me just jump in with Ardent Peak. Having said mine was published by some dubious individual, I've looked on Amazon and can see that there's a much nicer version than the one I have, published by Wyndham Press in 2013. Battle Studies, Ancient and Modern Battle by Colonel Ardent du Peak, and you can get that for £9 10p. And if you have that Amazon Prime, they will deliver it
eventually
by 10:30 tomorrow morning, or else, or something like that. Anyway, £9 10 for a really interesting read. But yours sounded good. Sidney, what about you?
Well, I've also brought in a book which is really focused on a personal experience. Mine's from about 300 years earlier, and it ties in with some of the thinking I've been doing on the 30 Years' War. So my book's not a new book. It was published in 1975, and it's called The Military Intellectual and Battle. And the subtitle of it is Raimondo Montecuccoli in the 30 Years' War, edited by Thomas Barker.
Not Phil Barker.
Not Phil Barker, no, not Phil Barker.
Not Sue Barker.
Not Sue Barker either.
Not Ronnie Barker.
No, none of those Barkers. It's Thomas Barker. He's a professor of history at New York University, or was. And it's the memoirs of Raimondo Montecuccoli, called Concerning Battle, Sulla Battaglia. And it's his personal account of how to command an army in warfare. Now, there's lots of military treatises in the 16th, 17th century which really go on about how somebody should command troops, and a lot of those are taken from the perception of works of the ancients, so Greek and Roman military authors who were known at that time. What makes this different is that Montecuccoli was a very significant imperial commander, both in the 30 Years' War and also in the French-Dutch Wars, which took place in the 1670s. And Montecuccoli's book isn't really focused on the battle experience of the individual soldiers. What it's really focused on, and this is all translated from the Italian, what it's really focused on is things to consider before a battle, how to make battle orders. There's a very significant section about that, on formations, alignments, fighting different terrains, securing flanks, crescent formations, fighting against different types of opponents. A section on the appurtenances to battle, which deals with prayer, who did the mass in front of the troops, battle signals, things then to consider within the battle itself. And that's where there is a section which deals with the tactical deployment of troops, the sort of things that a commander of an army would deal with personally, but not at the level of how to hold your pike, how to discharge your musket, how your individual squad moved. So this is the sort of book that one wants to read when one's thinking about an army level engagement or a very significant column of troops, say 10,000 troops. This is war from the focus of the chief commander in the battlefield. And importantly, there's also a significant section about things to think about after the battle, things to do if you're defeated, things to do if you're victorious, undecided engagements. And the book's a great book, and it's accompanied by a detailed sort of consideration of 4 of his great battles, although unfortunately not the battles that he fought against Turenne, who was one of the great French commanders at the time. And when you read the description of things to do with your army, you can disagree with a lot of these things, because some of them, quite frankly, he's theorising about war as opposed to what actually seems to have happened on the battlefield. But what makes it interesting is this is a how to do it account by somebody who was actually there, who was demonstrably there, commanding troops, commanding regiments, commanding brigades. And I think that makes it interesting to go through these and pick out some of the snippets of the things that he clearly thought were important or clearly wanted to change. And I think that sets it apart from some of the other drill books, which were really written by either soldiers who are old soldiers but not hugely experienced in war, or just military theoreticians from the 17th and 16th century.
So is it an example of evolution? Is he taking his experiences of battle and reframing them and representing them in a way to influence the way that future battles are fought? Is that his audience?
I think that is his potential audience, but I think there is also a validation. He's an imperial prince, he's a member of the Golden Fleece, which is the most senior Spanish division of nobility. This is his account of how things were done by him on the battlefield. It's a validation, but also an exhortation to other commanders to follow his footsteps. And in the 17th century, you have these various records of battles, which are produced, especially by imperial commanders, saying this is how we did it, this is how the battle was run. And one of the things we might sort of think about in a future podcast, as one of the books, is the visual representation of this, the artistic representation of battlefields by patrons who were there within the battle and commissioned paintings of that particular battle. But I think it's really more of a personal validation and an exhortation as opposed to this is now what we're going to do. He's not writing it from the position of a general staff. This is his personal validation of how battles should be fought.
So, and is there any evidence of that being used by people as they would apply that when they were fighting? Would it be something, I take his work as my handbook and apply that to the fight?
I think that's less so. I think certainly writers on military matters consulted this, but I don't think that this then became the sort of the Baedeker which you needed to have and which you'd consult before entering into the field. That's not the impression that I got.
It's interesting, isn't it, how some of these things can turn into those mantras, like for the Bolt's dicta for the aerial dogfighting, and Sailor Milan's 10 rules for air fighting. They become the thoughts of somebody on a topic, which then become the handbook for the next generation, and so on and so forth. You can the lineage of this thinking is really quite interesting.
Yeah. And certainly, I think writers in the 18th century and 19th century, knew of this book. So you look forward to the 19th century, and it gets quoted and it gets repeated, and people point out things that they agree with and disagree with. And it's similar in his own vein. He quotes from Machiavelli, who's a 16th century philosopher, also a military theorist, as he also quotes from the ancients as well. And there is this process of evolution of tactical thought and with it strategic thought and political diplomatic thought relating to on war. And that ultimately leads not so much to drill books, and this is how it's done with Seymour-Land's principle. This is one of the works which ultimately leads to Jomini and also to Clausewitz.
So there is a really interesting lineage, isn't there, that ties all these things together, which I don't know if anybody's ever mapped it, but wouldn't that be a fantastic project?
Yeah, well, there we go. So that's the military intellectual and battle. There's a hint in the title as to what kind of audience it's focused on, which is basically, the theory of war and how it's how it's impacted on the battlefield.
Well, we've gone very highbrow for once.
I didn't know what you were talking about.
It's a green book, but it's in the green section.
There are lots of pictures, which is very useful. So I'd normally ask at this point what you both have coming up, and to a degree we touched on that in the workshop section, but it's useful to ask also, guys, what's on the immediate horizon for both of you?
Oh, I'm off to Bristol. I'm off to Bristol for a weekend of sharp practice. Some guys from the Bristol War Games Club, I think it's called Bristol and District Band. I may be completely wrong there. Anyway, I've been invited down there to take part in and generally have some fun in a big jolly day of sharp practice with about 20 people all bringing along their armies and just having a general punch-up based on some really interesting sort of campaign rules that a gentleman by the name of David Hunter has put together.
Okay.
So, looking forward to that. That'll be exciting. I've never been to Bristol before.
Really?
Nice place.
Never been to
Very
Bristol
nice
before.
place.
Wow.
So, I've heard a lot about it. So, I'm looking forward to going down there and sampling the local culture. Or beer, anyway.
How about you, Nick?
Well, I don't get to go to such extravagant
You weren't
places.
invited. You weren't
No,
invited
that's
intentionally.
Probably wise. I'm on a short lead.
They said
Somebody
you were
has
too
to-
highbrow.
Yeah, somebody has to keep peddling the generator, don't they? Play testing. I really want to get some play testing out there and done. Games on the table. There's nothing like playing it through, refining it, changing it, going back, do it again. I love it.
Thank you.
That sounds fantastic. And because this is the first show of the year, I'd be remiss as a host if I wasn't going to ask you the next question, which is, have you got any New Year resolutions?
Well, I must admit, I thought my resolution was going to be...
It's already gone out the window.
Yeah, well, you know, we're a month into January, and my resolution was going to be to try and apply myself a little bit more to focusing on one thing at a time. But the problem is,
Clearly that didn't last.
you get pulled in so many directions at once, and as I touched on at the start of this programme, it's designing games is not a mechanical process, it's an evolutionary artistic process, and if I'm like a little bee in a honey field, buzzing along, and as a little flower comes up and looks interesting, I have to buzz my way over to it and have a good route around. And then I may discover that that's the next big flower for me to press, to extend the analogy. But you know, stay focused. But
So you're resolving not to be a bee, but a different type of insect. Is that basically what you're telling
What type
the
of
world?
insect would you like to
No,
do?
exactly.
A wasp. Great, so Richard's resolved to be a wasp
I-
for 2018. Nick!
No, what kind of insect could I be? A slow woodlouse kind of thing, probably. I am trying to focus more on creating habits that keep me in a good place when it comes to wargaming. This is quite topical,
It is.
listening to some other conversations around the hobby, but making time and consistent time to move projects forward, and which means working more closely, even more closely with Richard, to keep sticking flowers under his nose to some degree, that he can then decide when he wants to pollinate them. So yeah, part of that will be going on through that, but more play testing. That's my resolution. Get more. I want to get more stuff out there.
Sounds very good.
what about you, Sidney? Find more obscure and odd books to present to us.
I don't think that's a resolution. It's just my own habit. My resolution is to spend 15 minutes a day doing something relating to the hobby. So
That's good.
that would
You'll
be
have to
good.
sacrifice 15 minutes of doing something else.
So whether that's 15 minutes less sleep or not, I'm not sure at the moment. But
Okay.
anyway, so that's all we've got time for tonight. My thanks to Nick and Rich for joining me here on the sofa of
You're
truth.
The sofa of
The
truth.
sofa. Now there's a place.
I thought it was DFS.
You can get those at DFS.
I think the
Thanks for-
Gestapo should have used that a bit more, shouldn't they? Sit on the sofa of truth and tell us about your invasion plans.
Well, I don't like black as a colour, so. Thanks to you both for listening. In fact, thanks to everyone for listening. And don't forget to send in your letters with any questions you may have, any big issues you'd like to be discussed. And I think we've just got time for Roger and his band to play us out in his very familiar style. So Roger, over to you, sir.
In tonight's show, Sidney Roundwood was joined by Nick Skinner and Richard Clark with music by Roger Barraclough and his band.